There are secrets you bury not out of fear, but because shallow people are not qualified to know them. My sister looked at my $20 dress and 9-to-5 job, labeling me a low-class failure. She believed marrying a military hero made her absolute royalty. She did not realize the elite men she worshipped owed their lives to the shadows. Let me show you how one arrogant insult shattered $1 million illusion in a single heartbeat. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for your continuous support. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us with zero operating budget, which means we must halt all new video uploads here for the foreseeable future and transition our operations to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community to hear even better, longer, and incredibly detailed exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube, featuring a full cast of deeply emotional voice actors. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us dive into today's story and meet our protagonist, Selena Fleming. The air in the grand ballroom of the Charleston estate was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfumes and the hollow clinking of crystal champagne flutes. This was South Carolina high society at its most desperately ostentatious. Giant chandeliers cast a golden, unforgiving light over the sea of silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. In the absolute center of this shimmering vortex stood my younger sister, Victoria. She was the glowing bride-to-be, basking in the manufactured adoration of people whose names she probably could not even remember. I am Selena Fleming. I am 32 years old, and to the glittering crowd in this sprawling mansion, I am essentially a ghost, on paper, and to my deeply disappointed family, I am merely an inventory clerk at a dismal logistics warehouse, a woman who counts cardboard boxes for a meager hourly wage. My existence is defined by a 9-to-5 routine, so profoundly uninteresting that it usually takes Victoria less than 10 seconds to change the subject whenever my life is brought up in conversation. Tonight was Victoria's engagement party, the crowning achievement of her lifelong campaign to secure a position among the elite. She was marrying a high-ranking Navy commander, a golden ticket into the prestigious upper echelons of military high society. I watched her from the darkest corner of the room, sipping sparkling water from a plain glass. She was holding court, gesturing wildly with her diamond-encrusted hand, her voice carrying easily over the soft melodies of the hired string quartet. "Did you see the custom embroidery on his dress uniform?" Victoria gushed to a tight circle of wealthy wives. "Julian is practically royalty in the armed forces. It takes a very specific kind of woman to stand beside a man with that much power." She flicked her hair, shooting a brief, disdainful look in my direction, to make sure the stark contrast between us was clear to everyone watching. I glanced down at my own attire. I was wearing a plain, slate-gray dress I had bought from a clearance rack for $29. Beside the thousands of dollars wrapped around the bodies of the women passing by me, I looked exactly like what my sister wanted me to look like. A pathetic, unremarkable backdrop that made her shine even brighter. A few guests threw fleeting, pitying glances my way before turning back to their animated discussions about summer homes, designer handbags, and luxury yacht rentals. They measured a person's worth by the brand of their watch and the zip code of their primary residence. Their conversations washed over me like static. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, detached amusement. The truth is, I could not care less about the velvet ropes of their exclusive clubs or the heavy price tags on their Italian leather shoes. My mind was wired for a completely different reality. While these people stressed over whether their caterer used the right imported truffles, my brain was instinctively calculating the structural vulnerabilities of the mansion, mapping out the tactical exit routes, and noting the blind spots of the private security guards patrolling the terrace. I watched a man in a bespoke tuxedo loudly complain about a 2-hour flight delay, claiming it was the worst trauma he had endured all year. I simply stared at his polished shoes. My concept of trauma involved holding a severed tourniquet in a mud-filled trench, keeping a dying informant awake for 3 straight days until extraction finally arrived. The disconnect between my reality and theirs was a massive, unbridgeable chasm. I am accustomed to environments where the air tastes of sulfur and copper, not lavender and vanilla. For years, the soundtrack of my life was not the soft hum of classical string instruments, but the deafening roar of rotor blades, the static hiss of encrypted radio channels, and the sharp, terrifying crack of sniper fire echoing through a desolate valley. I was conditioned to read satellite heat signatures, to memorize the blueprints of subterranean bunkers, and to make split-second, life-or-death decisions that determined whether highly trained operatives made it back home to their families. To the world, I am a tired inventory clerk, but in the shadows that these socialites pretend do not exist, I was a prime asset for Echelon Vanguard. It was a completely off-the-books, top-secret tactical rescue organization. We were the ghosts sent in to extract high-value targets when diplomatic channels failed, operating entirely outside the jurisdiction of any official government. We did the bloody, brutal work that kept the world spinning, and we did it without medals, without parades, and without our names ever appearing on a single piece of unclassified paper. I took another sip of my water, leaning my back against the cool marble pillar. Victoria laughed loudly at something a senator's wife said, throwing her head back in a theatrical display of joy. She was living in a delicate glass house of arrogance and delusion, convinced that she had ascended to the apex of human achievement just by putting a ring on a soldier's finger. She thought I was nothing but a low-class failure, a stain on the family portrait. She had absolutely no idea that the very military heroes she was so eager to claim as her own peers were the exact same men who prayed for Echelon Vanguard to save them when all other hope was lost. My quiet observation was abruptly cut short. A sharp set of manicured fingernails dug viciously into my forearm. I did not flinch, though the grip was meant to hurt. Victoria had suddenly appeared at my side, her radiant smile replaced by a venomous sneer that she carefully hid from the view of the main room. Before I could say a word, she yanked my arm, dragging me away from the marble pillar and hauling me down a dimly lit, secluded corridor meant only for the catering staff. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind us, muting the elegant string music and the clinking of champagne glasses. The silence in the hallway was immediate and oppressive. Victoria spun around to face me, her eyes sweeping up and down my body with unfiltered revulsion. She looked at my plain gray dress as if it were a toxic hazard, her upper lip curling in sheer disgust. "What exactly do you think you are doing out there?" Victoria hissed, her voice vibrating with a suppressed, manic fury. She stepped into my personal space, pointing an accusatory finger at my chest. "I told Mother it was a catastrophic mistake to invite you tonight, but she insisted we had to maintain the image of a united family. But look at you. Look at what you are wearing to the most important night of my entire life." I remained completely still, my breathing slow and measured. "I am just standing out of the way, Victoria," I replied, keeping my vocal tone entirely flat. "You are breathing the same air as senators and admirals, and you look like you just clocked out of a homeless shelter," she spat back, her face turning a blotchy red under her expensive makeup. "You are an absolute embarrassment. Selena, you are entirely low class. Our parents broke their backs to give us every advantage, and while I built an empire of social grace and secured a future with the military elite, you chose to rot in a dusty warehouse counting cardboard boxes for $20 an hour. You are a miserable, unmotivated failure, and your very presence here is a repulsive smear on my perfect evening." She paced back and forth in the narrow corridor, her silk gown rustling aggressively against the floorboards. The toxicity radiated off her in palpable waves. This was not a new dynamic. For decades, Victoria had used me as the designated punching bag for her own deep-seated insecurities, feeding her monstrous ego by constantly tearing down my quiet existence. She stopped pacing and stepped close to me again, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Listen to me very carefully, because I am only going to say this once," she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. You are strictly forbidden from going anywhere near the VIP tables. You are absolutely not to approach, look at, or attempt to strike up a conversation with Julian. You are not to speak to his squad mates. You will not engage with anyone wearing a military uniform or carrying a rank. Do you understand me? I held her furious gaze without blinking, my expression locked into an unreadable mask. Julian is a highly decorated commanding officer, Victoria continued, puffing out her chest with borrowed pride. He leads the most elite, driven men on the face of the planet. He actively despises lazy, useless people who have no ambition in life. Men like him do not have the patience or the tolerance for women like you. If he finds out that my own flesh and blood is a glorified forklift operator, it will humiliate me beyond repair. I will not let your pathetic, stagnant life infect my perfect future. You will stay in the shadows. You will keep your mouth completely shut, and you will leave early. Do not humiliate me. Selena. Under normal circumstances, a verbal assault of this magnitude would shatter a person. A normal sister would cry, argue, or storm out of the mansion in a fit of righteous anger. But I was far from normal. As Victoria unleashed her vicious psychological attack, my mind automatically shifted into a highly specialized defensive protocol. During my time in the covert operative training camps, I endured advanced psychological resistance courses. I had been strapped to steel chairs in freezing subterranean cells, interrogated by master manipulators, trained to break the human spirit using sleep deprivation and unspeakable mental cruelty. Compared to the elite interrogators of foreign intelligence agencies, Victoria's high school level bullying was as harmless as a slight summer breeze. My heart rate did not elevate by a single beat. The micro muscles in my face remained entirely relaxed. My eyes were void of any hurt, anger, or intimidation. I simply looked at my sister, acknowledging her frantic demands with the cold, detached efficiency of a soldier receiving a meaningless briefing. I gave a single, slow nod. Understood, I said softly. Victoria seemed momentarily unsettled by my utter lack of reaction. She had wanted tears. She had wanted me to cower. Instead, she hit a solid brick wall. Frustrated but satisfied that her orders were delivered, she scoffed loudly, turned on her designer heels, and pushed her way back through the heavy oak doors, instantly plastering her radiant, fake smile back onto her face for the waiting crowd. I took a steadying breath in the quiet corridor, adjusting the cuffs of my cheap gray dress. I pushed the doors open just enough to slip back into the grand ballroom. True to my sister's vicious demands, I bypassed the glittering center of the room entirely. I navigated the perimeter of the hall with silent, calculated footsteps, eventually positioning myself right next to the kitchen entrance where the catering staff hurried back and forth with silver trays of appetizers. I stood in the dimmest corner I could find, crossing my arms and blending perfectly into the background drapery. I became an invisible, silent shadow, a complete non-entity in this house of vanity, waiting patiently in the dark exactly as I had been commanded. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance swung open, and the shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. It was as if the air pressure in the grand ballroom had suddenly dropped. The lively chatter of the elite guests died out in a sweeping wave, and the elegant music from the string quartet seemed to fade into a distant, insignificant hum. Every head turned, every eye locked onto the threshold. Commander Julian Vance had arrived, and he had not come alone. He strode into the opulent hall flanked by 5 members of his elite Navy SEAL extraction team. The moment they crossed into the light of the chandeliers, time seemed to slow down to a crawl. They were a breathtaking force of nature, dressed in immaculate, midnight blue dress uniforms, the gold buttons, the crisp white gloves, and the heavy rows of perfectly polished medals pinned to their chests caught the light, flashing fiercely across the room. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that instantly commanded absolute authority. Beside their rigid, imposing frames, the wealthy politicians, trust fund heirs, and corporate giants in the room suddenly looked incredibly soft and utterly defenseless. Victoria practically sprinted across the expansive marble floor. The heavy silk of her gown dragged behind her as she threw herself at Julian, She wrapped both of her arms tightly around his right bicep, pressing herself against his uniform. She did not cling to him with the quiet warmth of a loving partner. Instead, she anchored herself to his side with the desperate, triumphant grip of a socialite displaying her most priceless, exclusive acquisition to a room full of bitter rivals. She beamed a blinding 100-watt smile, aggressively soaking in the collective awe and deep envy of the high society crowd surrounding them. From my concealed position in the dim corner near the kitchen doors, the civilian world completely melted away. The glittering cocktail dresses and the expensive tuxedo jackets blurred out of focus. My brain, hardwired by years of deep cover survival and relentless operational conditioning, involuntarily switched into an active tactical assessment mode. I was no longer looking at a celebrated bridal party entering a joyous celebration. I was evaluating a highly trained combat unit infiltrating an unsecured, highly populated perimeter, even wrapped in formal wear and surrounded by waiters carrying silver trays of caviar. The squad maintained a flawless, invisible diamond formation. It was muscle memory, ingrained into their very bones. I watched their eyes. They were in constant, rapid motion, performing a relentless threat assessment of the ballroom. They scanned the main exits, tracked the structural integrity of the elevated indoor balconies, and carefully cataloged every single catering staff member who was carrying a heavy metallic tray. Physically, they were standing in one of the safest, most exclusive zip codes in South Carolina, but psychologically, their minds were still navigating hostile territory. It was the permanent, inescapable hypervigilance of men who had spent their entire adult lives operating in the deadly crosshairs of the enemy. My professional gaze swept over each man, dissecting their physical conditions with clinical precision. I studied the imposing soldier taking the rear guard position. He was an absolute mountain of muscle, but his gait was microscopically uneven. With every third step he took, he placed just a fraction less weight on his right leg. It was a severe, traumatic hamstring tear. It had healed poorly and was cleverly masked from civilian eyes, but it was screamingly obvious to a trained operative who knew what to look for. Then, my eyes shifted back to Commander Julian Vance himself. As Victoria aggressively pulled on his arm to introduce him to a prominent local judge, Julian offered a perfectly polite, charming smile, but I saw the subtle, rigid tension locking his jaw. As he reached out to shake the judge's hand, he subtly rotated his left shoulder. It was a microscopic flinch, a suppressed wince revealing a chronic, grinding pain echoing deep within the ball and socket joint. The wealthy socialites, admiring his gleaming medals, undoubtedly thought that specific shoulder injury was the romantic result of some glorious, heroic training exercise, or perhaps a daring parachute jump detailed in a heavily sanitized, official military press release. Victoria had probably bragged to her country club friends that it was a badge of honor from a classified combat mission in the Middle East, a story tailored for maximum social impact. They were all completely, hopelessly wrong. My breath hitched in my throat. A cold, phantom sensation suddenly washed over my hands as a vivid, violent memory flared violently to life in my mind. I knew exactly why the towering rear guard favored his right leg. I knew exactly why Commander Vance could not fully rotate his left shoulder without wincing. I knew the truth because, exactly 4 years and 2 months ago, I was the one who had to forcefully relocate that very shoulder. It happened in the suffocating, pitch-black darkness of a collapsing underground tunnel system in South America. My hands had been completely slick with their blood, struggling for traction while the deafening roar of enemy artillery rained down above us, turning the earth into a living nightmare. It was a brutally violent, highly classified disaster that never officially happened on any government record. It was a blood-soaked secret buried so incredibly deep that not even the commander's own family, nor his beautiful bride-to-be, were ever cleared to know about it. And yet, here that very same secret was, standing right in front of me in a brightly lit ballroom full of oblivious billionaires, sipping champagne. The air in the ballroom was growing heavier by the minute. The presence of the tactical team had shifted the invisible currents of the room, And the proximity to a past I had buried deep beneath layers of civilian monotony was suddenly suffocating. I had seen exactly what I came to see. I had confirmed with my own two eyes that the men I had pulled from the jaws of absolute hell 4 years ago were alive, highly decorated, and breathing the sweet, air-conditioned oxygen of a high society gala. There was absolutely no need to linger and risk the structural integrity of the careful, boring lie I called my life, deciding to honor the vicious, pathetic little rules Victoria had laid out in the hallway. I turned my back on the glittering spectacle. My extraction plan was simple, efficient, and entirely discreet. I mapped a direct route along the shadowed perimeter of the grand hall, aiming for a heavy mahogany side door that led to the catering preparation tents and out toward the valet parking driveway. I calculated that it would take me exactly 45 seconds to slip through the exit, retrieve my rusted sedan, and disappear into the humid South Carolina night without leaving a single trace. I was less than 10 feet away from my designated exit when the sudden anomaly occurred. A young, visibly frantic waiter, balancing an oversized silver tray piled dangerously high with empty crystal champagne flutes, burst out of the swinging kitchen doors. He was looking over his left shoulder, panicking about an order, completely blind to his forward trajectory. He slammed hard into my right shoulder. My ingrained physical conditioning kept me firmly planted on my feet, absorbing the shock without a single stumble. But the sudden impact violently jolted my arm. The cheap, faux leather purse I was holding slipped from my grip. It hit the polished marble floor with a dull, entirely unglamorous thud, sliding a few inches toward the center of the illuminated walkway. The waiter gasped in sheer panic, whispering a frantic, breathless apology before darting away into the crowd, terrified of losing his minimum wage job over a dropped tray. I let out a silent breath, stepping forward to retrieve my pathetic little bag. But before my hand could reach it, a highly polished, heavy military dress shoe stepped into my peripheral vision. A man descended into a smooth, effortless crouch, his movements fluid and tightly controlled despite the heavy formal uniform. It was one of Commander Julian Vance's elite squad members, the communications specialist I had briefly observed earlier. Up close, the imposing aura of his midnight blue uniform was overwhelming. He scooped up my cheap purse with a large, heavily calloused hand that looked entirely out of place holding such a flimsy, inexpensive civilian object as he straightened his towering frame, extending the bag toward me. Our eyes met. It was supposed to be a fleeting, meaningless exchange, a polite, split-second interaction between a celebrated war hero and an invisible, forgettable wallflower. But the very moment his gaze locked onto mine, time froze completely. I watched his micro-expressions shift in a rapid, violent sequence. First, there was polite, rehearsed courtesy. Then, a sudden spark of deep, jarring confusion. His pupils dilated instantly. The muscles in his square jaw tightened until they twitched visibly under his skin. He froze, his massive frame turning rigid as a statue. His hand suspended in midair, holding my purse. He was staring directly into my eyes with the sheer, unadulterated terror and absolute bewilderment of a man who had just watched a ghost walk straight out of a solid brick wall. He did not recognize the gray clearance rack dress. He did not recognize the neat, unimposing civilian hairstyle, but he recognized the cold, dead calm emptiness in my eyes. He recognized the specific, calculated way I was standing, shifting my weight perfectly to maintain a defensive center of gravity. His brain was desperately trying to bridge the massive psychological gap between a brightly lit Charleston ballroom and a blood-soaked nightmare he had sworn to take to his grave. His mouth opened slightly. His voice, when it finally came, was a raspy, hesitant whisper. "Wait, do I know you?" He stopped himself abruptly, swallowing hard. He could not process the logic of his own question. The sheer impossibility of the situation was actively short-circuiting his cognitive functions. Before he could forcefully reboot his brain and demand an actual answer, a sharp, piercing voice sliced right through the heavy tension. "Selena!" The name was spoken like a venomous curse wrapped in velvet. I did not need to turn my head to know that Victoria had locked onto my position like a precision heat-seeking missile. From 50 yards across the crowded room, her predatory social radar had detected the exact scenario she had expressly forbidden. She saw her utterly disgraceful, low-class sister standing face-to-face with one of her precious military elite. The rustling of heavy silk grew loud and aggressive. Victoria was practically marching across the marble floor, her manicured fingers digging like steel claws into Commander Julian Vance's forearm, physically dragging her bewildered fiancé away from a group of wealthy real estate investors. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, suppressed rage. She was absolutely terrified that I was desperately trying to steal the spotlight, that I was actively sabotaging her flawless reputation by opening my mouth and exposing my miserable $20 an hour existence to the very people she worshipped. She reached us in a matter of seconds. The squad member instantly snapped to attention, tearing his haunted, confused gaze away from me to acknowledge his commanding officer. I braced myself for the vicious, whispered scolding. I fully expected Victoria to forcefully shove me through the side door and banish me to the parking lot for breaking her rules. But as she looked at Julian, then at his shaken squad mate, and finally down at my cheap, scuffed purse, a twisted, brilliant calculation flashed across her perfectly contoured face. Her sheer arrogance violently overpowered her initial panic. She realized that kicking me out right in front of them would cause an awkward scene, but keeping me here could serve a far more sinister, self-serving purpose. Why hide her disgraceful sister when she could use me as a stepping stone? She could publicly contrast my pathetic, stagnant life with her own glorious ascent, cementing her image as the incredibly gracious, benevolent aristocrat who still tolerated her severely inadequate family members. The venom in her eyes vanished, replaced instantly by a sickeningly sweet, theatrical warmth. She released Julian's arm and stepped smoothly between me and the exit, completely cutting off my only escape route. "Oh, you are not leaving already, are you?" Victoria cooed loudly, projecting her voice to ensure it carried to the surrounding VIP tables. She reached out and grabbed my shoulder, her grip punishingly tight beneath the thin fabric of my dress. She turned me to face her commanding fiancé, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. "Julian, darling, please forgive my terrible manners. In all the excitement, I completely forgot to introduce you to someone very special." The trap was fully set. The ticking time bomb of the past, carried in the haunted eyes of the soldier standing right beside us, was about to detonate, and my sister, utterly blind to the invisible tripwires she was dancing across, was the one aggressively pressing the trigger. Victoria's grip on my shoulder was like a steel vise, her neatly manicured nails digging fiercely into my collarbone as she held me firmly in place. She practically vibrated with malicious anticipation. She had meticulously orchestrated this exact moment to be her ultimate triumph, a live, public demonstration of her absolute superiority. She tilted her head, her diamond earrings catching the brilliant chandelier light, and delivered her lines with a sickeningly sweet, heavily perfumed cadence. "Julian, darling," she began, projecting her voice just loud enough to ensure the surrounding elite guests and wealthy VIPs were silently tuning in to the spectacle. "This is my older sister, Selena." Victoria let the name hang in the air for a fraction of a second, just long enough for it to sound like a tragic apology. She let out a delicate, perfectly practiced sigh of deep familial disappointment. She just lugs inventory books around at a rather run-down warehouse. She lives a very simple, very content life. She substituted the word content for pathetic, but everyone in the immediate vicinity perfectly understood the brutal translation. It was a flawless, merciless social execution, deliberately designed to elevate her own status by standing directly on my throat. Commander Julian Vance turned his imposing frame fully toward me. He was holding a heavy, intricately cut crystal tumbler in his right hand, the expensive amber whiskey inside swirling gently over two large, pristine cubes of ice. The man was a walking masterpiece of elite military conditioning, projecting absolute confidence, refined charm, and a rugged elegance that made him the undisputed center of gravity in the entire mansion. His steel blue eyes, which had been previously sharp and commanding when addressing his wealthy peers, softened noticeably as they landed on my cheap, slate gray dress and my remarkably plain, unadorned features. I stood perfectly still and watched the micro-expressions ripple across his handsome face. I saw the immediate shift in his rapid cognitive assessment. He cataloged my inexpensive, scuffed shoes, my total lack of jewelry, and my seemingly submissive posture. The resulting emotion that washed over his features was not disgust, nor was it the harsh condescension my sister so desperately craved. It was pity. It was a gentle, deeply patronizing sympathy reserved exclusively for the hopelessly inadequate. He viewed me as a fragile, unremarkable civilian who needed to be handled with extreme delicacy so as not to shatter my supposedly delicate ego. He offered me a brilliant, effortlessly polite smile, the exact kind of comforting smile seasoned politicians reserve for charity cases, and smoothly extended his free left hand to offer a formal, gentlemanly greeting. I did not look away. I did not shrink under the crushing, humiliating weight of his sympathy. I simply reached out to meet his gesture. As I lifted my arm, the stiff, poorly stitched fabric of my bargain bin dress snagged slightly against my skin. The gray sleeve rode up my forearm, just a tiny fraction of an inch. It was a microscopic, entirely unintended wardrobe malfunction, exposing barely 2 inches of pale skin directly above my wrist joint. But in the grand, deadly, unforgiving theater of covert operations, tiny fractions of an inch were absolutely all it took to alter the entire course of history. I gripped his large, heavily calloused hand firmly. I did not offer the weak, trembling, limp handshake of an intimidated warehouse clerk. I locked my thumb securely around his, establishing a solid, undeniable grip that demanded immediate respect. I looked straight past his polished, aristocratic exterior, staring directly into the dark pupils of his eyes, and I completely dropped the carefully constructed, invisible civilian mask I had worn all evening. I allowed my vocal cords to relax completely, dropping my pitch into a deep, highly resonant, and distinctly cold register. It was the exact, emotionless, calculating tone I utilized exclusively when transmitting life-or-death tactical directives over heavily encrypted military communication channels. "I just make sure things are pulled out of the danger zone right on time, Commander," I stated. The words slipped past my conscious filter, an automatic, deeply ingrained reflex responding directly to a highly classified tactical environment. Simultaneously, the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead crystal chandelier illuminated the exposed skin of my left wrist, etched deeply into my flesh. Standing out in stark, jagged contrast against my skin was a violent, brutal burn scar. It was shaped exactly like a thick, serrated lightning bolt, wrapping aggressively around the radial bone. It was not a neat surgical scar, nor was it a common household burn. It was a gruesome, highly specific brand, permanently melted into my flesh by a jagged piece of superheated artillery shrapnel during a catastrophic, entirely off-the-books extraction mission deep within the impenetrable jungles of South America over 4 years ago. The very second Julian's hand secured its grip on mine, his thumb brushed directly over the raised, uneven, rigid texture of that specific scar. The physical, tactile confirmation, crashing simultaneously into his brain alongside the exact phonetic frequency and chilling cadence of my voice, acted as a devastating, unstoppable neurological trigger. I stood perfectly still and watched a highly decorated, battle-hardened military commander, a man who had undoubtedly survived advanced torture simulations and relentless enemy crossfire, experience a catastrophic psychological collapse right in the middle of a polite society gathering. The charming, pitying smile did not just fade from his face, it was violently eradicated. The muscles around his square jaw locked into a state of sheer, absolute rigidity, the tendons in his neck pulling taut like heavy steel cables. His breathing, which had been slow and controlled just a millisecond prior, abruptly ceased entirely. His chest completely stopped moving. I stared straight into his steel blue eyes and watched his pupils violently and rapidly constrict until they were nothing but tiny, terrified black pinpricks. His mind was violently ejected from the lavish, air-conditioned Charleston ballroom. He was instantly, forcibly dragged backward through time and space. I could see the exact, horrifying moment. The suppressed sensory flashbacks hijacked his central nervous system. He was no longer smelling the expensive floral arrangements or the high-end perfumes of the socialites. He was choking on the overwhelming, metallic stench of fresh blood, raw cordite, and wet, suffocating earth. He was no longer hearing the soft, elegant melodies of the hired string quartet. He was hearing the deafening, frantic crackle of a dead radio channel, the terrifying whistle of falling mortar shells, and the agonizing screams of his trapped men. He was feeling the blinding, white-hot agony of his left shoulder being violently dislocated inside a pitch-black, rapidly collapsing subterranean tunnel. And most intensely of all, he was remembering the shadowy, nameless operative who had descended directly into that fiery pit of hell. He was remembering the woman who had grabbed him by his shredded tactical vest with that exact same jagged, scarred hand, forcefully relocating his shoulder in the pitch dark and dragging his half-dead body out of a literal bomb crater while barking flawless, life-saving orders in that exact same cold, commanding, angelic voice. All the blood instantly drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent shade of ashen gray. His massive, imposing frame actually swayed backward a fraction of an inch, completely losing its flawless military center of gravity. The sheer, unadulterated psychological shockwave completely severed the connection between his conscious brain and his basic motor functions. His right hand, suspended in the air, simply stopped working. The nerve endings went entirely numb. His thick fingers went completely, inexplicably limp. The heavy crystal tumbler slipped right through his paralyzed grip. It seemed to fall through the air in an agonizingly slow, drawn-out sequence. The expensive amber liquid splashed upward as the heavy glass struck the polished marble floor with a sharp, incredibly violent crash. The thick crystal shattered into hundreds of jagged, glittering pieces, sending ice cubes and whiskey skittering violently across the pristine floorboards. The deafening sound of the shattering glass echoed like a gunshot, violently ripping through the polite, civilized hum of the engagement party and plunging the immediate vicinity into an absolute, breathless, terrifying silence. The sharp, violent crash of the crystal glass shattered the delicate, manufactured illusion of the evening in an instant. Victoria let out a dramatic, high-pitched shriek, instinctively leaping backward as a few stray drops of amber liquid splashed against the hem of her exorbitant silk gown. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered irritation. She aggressively snapped her manicured fingers in the air, instantly demanding the attention of a terrified busboy hovering near the edge of the crowd. "Get a towel and clean this mess up immediately," Victoria barked, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of the polished elegance she had been faking all night. She turned back to her fiancé, reaching out to brush an imaginary speck of dust off his immaculate uniform. "I am so sorry, Julian. Darling, I have absolutely no idea what is wrong with her. She is incredibly clumsy and entirely out of her element. I told you it was a catastrophic mistake to let her out of the—" Victoria's words died a sudden, violent death in her throat. She finally looked at Julian's face, and the sheer, unadulterated shock radiating from him forced her into a stunned, breathless silence. Commander Julian Vance was completely ignoring her. He did not feel her hand on his chest. He did not hear her shrill, pathetic complaints. His broad chest was heaving, his breathing ragged and incredibly shallow, pulling in oxygen like a man who had just broken the surface of freezing water. His intense, steel-blue eyes remained entirely locked onto mine, burning with a complex, overwhelming mixture of raw disbelief and the most profound, soul-crushing reverence I had ever witnessed in a human being. I took a slow, trembling step forward, completely ignoring the shattered glass crunching beneath his polished military shoes. The highly decorated, fiercely composed military leader was visibly shaking. He opened his mouth, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a deep, gravelly whisper that carried the immense weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "Whiskey Tango Angel, it is you. the dark angel of Echelon. The collective gasp that rippled through the immediate circle of wealthy socialites was highly audible. They did not understand the classified military jargon, but they absolutely understood the massive tectonic shift in power that had just occurred in their presence. The patronizing pity they had previously directed at my cheap dress and unimposing posture evaporated into thin air, replaced by a sudden, electric confusion. Victoria let out a nervous, utterly bewildered laugh, aggressively pulling on Julian's arm once again. "Julian, what on earth are you talking about? Echelon? What is that? She is just a warehouse worker. She counts cardboard boxes for a living, for heaven's sake. You are confused." Julian finally reacted to Victoria, but absolutely not in the way she desperately wanted. He forcefully shrugged off her grip with a sharp, undeniable motion of pure, absolute disgust. He did not even turn his head to look at her. His gaze remained anchored entirely to me, acting as if looking away meant I would vanish back into the smoke and shadows. "She is not an inventory clerk," Julian stated. His voice began to rise, the commanding, authoritative baritone effortlessly echoing across the dead-silent ballroom. The string quartet had completely stopped playing mid-note. Every single guest, every politician, every billionaire in the Charleston mansion was now staring at the epicenter of the commotion. Julian squared his massive shoulders, his chest swelling with fierce, undeniable pride. He addressed the entire room, stripping away the sanitized, civilian-friendly version of his celebrated career. Exactly 4 years ago, my squad was completely compromised. We were betrayed, ambushed, and driven into a collapsing underground cartel tunnel system deep in hostile territory. We were completely blind. Our communications were dead. The air was running out, and the enemy was heavily armed and rapidly closing in on our position. We were officially designated as a total loss. The command structure wrote us off as dead men walking. He gestured toward me, his hand trembling slightly with the raw, unfiltered emotion of the violent memory. "This woman right here. The woman you just introduced to me as a low-class failure. She disobeyed direct orders from the highest levels of the government. She went completely rogue, solo-hacked a military-grade security network, and voluntarily dropped into a pitch-black, collapsing hellhole by herself. She found us in the dark. She fought off the advance guard, forcefully relocated my dislocated shoulder with her bare hands, and physically dragged my squad through the mud and blood until we saw the sky again." The silence in the room was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, the exact kind of terrifying stillness that follows a massive explosion. The wealthy politicians, trust fund heirs, and corporate titans stood frozen like incredibly expensive statues, their champagne flutes hanging limply in their manicured hands. The very foundation of their elitist, superficial worldview was actively disintegrating before their terrified eyes. "We owe every single breath we have taken for the last 4 years entirely to her," Julian finished, his voice cracking with a fierce, unwavering loyalty that could never be bought with money or social status. The reaction from the 5 other men in the midnight blue uniforms was instantaneous, as if struck by a massive, invisible bolt of lightning. The elite tactical squad moved in perfect, fluid unison. The communications specialist who had dropped my purse, the towering rear guard with the ruined hamstring, every single one of them aggressively snapped to attention. The deafening, synchronized crack of their polished leather heels slamming together echoed like a gunshot through the opulent ballroom. They stood incredibly rigid, their chests puffed out, and raised their right hands in a sharp, flawless military salute, completely ignoring the bewildered civilians surrounding them. They were publicly honoring a ghost, a living legend who had bled for them when the rest of the world had turned its back. I watched Victoria's carefully constructed empire burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. Her face, previously flushed with arrogant triumph, drained of all color until it matched the pristine white tablecloths. Her jaw hung open, her eyes darting frantically between Julian's reverent salute, the rigid squad of elite soldiers, and my calm, emotionless face. She tried to speak, to salvage her fractured dignity, but absolutely no sound came out of her throat. The wealthy socialites she had spent years aggressively courting were now staring at her. Their eyes were no longer filled with envy or admiration. They were looking at her with pure, unadulterated contempt. She had just publicly humiliated the very savior of the military hero she was using to climb the social ladder. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. Victoria slumped heavily into a velvet accent chair, her expensive silk dress crumpling around her like a deflated parachute. She was physically shaking, gasping for air as the crushing weight of her absolute, irreversible humiliation pinned her to the floorboards. She was nothing now, just a petty, hollow shell completely exposed to the unforgiving glare of the society she worshipped so dearly. I did not smile. I did not offer a single word of gloating or a triumphant monologue. That was not how Echelon Vanguard operated. I simply reached down with my right hand and calmly pulled the stiff, gray fabric of my cheap sleeve back down, completely concealing the jagged, serrated burn scar from civilian eyes once again. I looked at Julian, seeing the ghosts of the past finally settling quietly in his eyes, and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. Without uttering another word, I turned my back on the glittering chandelier, the shattered crystal, and the broken bride. I walked slowly and deliberately toward the heavy mahogany front doors. The sea of wealthy elites actively parted for me, stepping back with wide, terrified eyes, completely too afraid to even breathe in my direction. I stepped out into the cool, humid South Carolina night, leaving behind a sacred, reverent silence and completely redefining what it truly meant to have class. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in and listening to my story. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below. If you found today's story thrilling and want more, I must remind you that YouTube has unfortunately disabled our channel's monetization. We simply do not have the budget to continue uploading new videos here for the foreseeable future. However, we are moving our operations over to Patreon. Please help us keep the channel alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community, where you can listen to our absolute best, longest, and most detailed exclusive true stories that we cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and stay strong.